My experience is that if in some way I fail to connect with the highest, with the ultimate, with God, that if I begin to drift away from a sense of communion with Him, that something of a downward spiral begins. And I don't like it. I don't like the sense of separation, the loss of vitality, the loss of enthusiasm. It feels like a terrible loss, and left with a kind of sluggish feeling, I can't stand it for long and make efforts to come back home, which is to come back to myself and to come back to God. That's for me how it goes, is the way things go. I'm either ascending towards the highest or beginning a descent into lower regions. Now, I often meet people who I don't think can identify with this language of ascending or descending. Theirs is a less precise language, reflecting perhaps an inner condition of agnosticism, which amounts to, I think, some kind of attempt not to have to choose. But my sense about this agnosticism is that it actually is a choice as well. It's a choice to inhabit the gray zone, a sort of nebulous state. And I think that trying to remain on the fence in this way leads inevitably downwards. For the fact is, there's no inspiration in the agnostic state. You are undecided and merely drifting along, and if drifting, you're eventually going to be found downstream somewhere. I mean, isn't this what truly happens all the time? Perhaps, for example, there was a dream and a determination early in one's life to go for the highest, but alas, as the years have passed, you've become a friend of some forms of shabbiness. You once had high ideals, but have now settled for lower ones. You become, in other words, passive and tolerant, having fully conformed to the mediocre spirit of the age. You now act in accordance with that spirit of the age, accepting its soul-sapping norms of behavior. Now, when I speak about going for the highest, going for the absolute, about being in relation to God, I'm talking about heading towards an experience which we were made for, which is that we were made to be in relation to the absolute. Therefore, if we fail to find and affirm that relationship, the chances are very good that we'll make an absolute out of some lesser God. For nature abhors a vacuum, as does your heart. We'll find some way, therefore, to try to fill up that gnawing sense of emptiness, for we need to feel that our life is about something. The crucial question is whether one's life is about a pursuit of the highest or about something less worthy than that. Now, if we're in relation to the highest, we'll know the experience of what I've elsewhere called the great shattering, which is that life-transforming experience of when your ego is pulverized by the power of grace, as in the experience of the meditation master, Guru Mai. She writes of when, at one point in her life, she found a sense of meaning through identifying with images of herself through 1,000 mirrors. But then grace struck, powerful grace, and one by one, these 1,000 mirrors, her 1,000 points of identification, were smashed until only one mirror remained. The one remaining mirror was that mirror of herself that had to do with her identification with herself as an ego consisting of its multiple demands. Like this is like a posture of defiance. But grace won out, it was that strong. And that last point of identification was purged. Guru Mai, then as a young woman, became a fully transparent channel of grace. No ego remained to block the divine force. Now, I think that Guru Mai's experience parallels that of other seekers who finally said to themselves, enough is enough. Enough of passively drifting along. Enough of being like a nowhere man or a nowhere woman. Determined, therefore, to ascend to the highest, one begins to take in philosophies and psychologies and activities that are elevating instead of disfiguring. Now, on an upward path, you begin to look for sources of inspiration, such as you can find in St. Paul's letter to the Philippians. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever's true, whatever's noble, whatever's right, whatever's pure, whatever's lovely, whatever's admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. So with a new resolve in your life, you think about such things. You fill your life up with the contemplation of what is true, right, noble, pure, lovely, and admirable. and then increasingly filled up with what you've been contemplating, you also then make a habit of rejecting those things that you know will take you down. You begin to practice what I call a kind of a blessed intolerance of any possible obstacles to spiritual realization. So, for example, for this year's vacation, you decide to head for the Abbey of Gethsemane Monastery in Kentucky instead of to Vegas. Every year, thousands of people travel there to Our Lady of Gethsemane. It's a monastery set in the rolling hills of Kentucky, and here's the key to their motivation. It is to immerse themselves in a world wholly at odds with modern life. This is what Emily Smith writes about in the latest issue of the New Criterion. By making such a journey, like what you're doing is you're countering the culture by immersing yourself in a world wholly at odds with modern life, which is to be drawn to a life defined by silence, constraint, and meditation. I mean, imagine one's life being defined by silence, constraint, and meditation. Well, this is the quality of life that Thomas Merton chose after failing to find satisfaction in his various experiments. As Merton himself put it, I became the complete 20th century man. In other words, a lost man, completely lost and confused. Merton, that complete 20th century man, had fancied himself an intellectual and acted like it. In college, he dabbled in communism, became a pacifist, wrote for literary publications, flirted with a lot of women, drank a lot of alcohol, read a lot of D.H. Lawrence, but his freewheeling lifestyle failed to bring him any kind of fulfillment. As Merton wrote, if what most people take for granted were really true, if all you needed to be happy was to grab everything and see everything and investigate every experience and then talk about it, well, I should have been a very happy person, a spiritual millionaire from the cradle even until now. The reality, though, was that for Merton, and he had become a shallow young man with an inner life that was a mess of raging appetites and desires. But this state, I'm glad to report, did not continue, for Merton felt the pull of a countervailing force, and it moved towards becoming a vision, some kind of transcendent experience, a vision of transcendence. And that once having had that experience, in the light of it, Merton then began to recognize his sorry state. He was overwhelmed with a sudden and profound insight into the misery and corruption of his own soul. He prayed to God to help free him from the 1,000 terrible things that kept him in a state of slavery. So Merton, too, like Guru Mai, could think of 1,000 things that kept him from spiritual realization. And like Guru Mai, when the 1,000 fetters were abandoned, well, freedom took their place. Now, in his own way, George Harrison of the Beatles as well joined this band of brothers and sisters who decide to embark on the spiritual path. For George it had to do with finally seeing through the emptiness of the mania that he had helped to create and lived in. As when, for example, giving an example of a visit to where it was reported that great mania was going on, where people were finding some kind of enlightenment, was in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. And as reported by Harrison's first wife, Patty Boyd, and I quote, "We were expecting Haight-Ashbury to be special, like a creative, artistic place filled with beautiful people. But it was horrible, full of ghastly dropouts, bums, and spotty youth, all out of their brains." I mean, Haight-Ashbury was more like a gutter of human depravity than anything else. As Patty Boyd writes in her book, Wonderful Tonight, everybody looks stoned, even mothers and babies. Well, George Harrison and company got out of that deadly sewer fast. In the last interview before his death, George Harrison reflected that he had attained everything the world had to offer. His conclusion, it meant nothing to him. He had had quite enough of the mania. His salvation was related to the discovery of the pure music of an Eastern holy man, Ravi Shankar, whose music has been described as the equivalent of Mozart. "Nobody," George exclaimed, "ever impressed me until I met Ravi Shankar." In a wonderful piece in the Wall Street Journal entitled "When Ravi Shankar Met George Harrison," it quotes Mr. Harrison saying, Mr. Shankar was the first person who ever impressed me in my life. Well, George Harrison describes his breakthrough into spiritual life in this way. During the days when there was the mania, the Beatlemania, well, I got involved with the records. I bought some of Ravi's records and I listened. And although my intellect didn't really know what was happening or didn't know much about the music, just the pure sound of it and what was playing, it just appealed to me so much. And he says, it hit a spot in me very deep. It was, I just recognized it somehow. Harrison then goes on, and quoting Bob Dylan, who had said, he not busy being born is busy dying. Well, George was tired of dying, and he opened the door, he opened his heart to spiritual life. Well, I think the experiences of Gurmai, Thomas Merton, and George Harrison have in common this vision of transcendence that changes everything, which, and I want to share here, can be defined more precisely as the experience of aesthetic arrest. In a state of aesthetic arrest, this is a state of pure contemplation. It's a state of awe when your mind is arrested and raised above desire and loathing. It's been described as a level of feeling that is beyond mere feelings or emotions. So this vision of transcendence, this pure state of contemplation, aesthetic arrest, that is the possible experience for those who choose to seek the highest and who reject the many lower options. For we are not like cockroaches, according to Richard Dawkins, who sprang spontaneously and meaningless by sheer chance. We're not on the level of cockroaches. No, we came from God. We were meant to exist in relationship with Him. The realization of God, the vision of transcendence, is what will set us free.